I was recently looking at the headlines and noticed a recurring theme. A bloodbath in the auto industry, politicians fuming about Chinese electric cars sneaking across borders, and a general sense of panic that the US is being outplayed. Everyone seems to have a very strong, very angry opinion about how China suddenly stole the lead in the EV race. But if you step back from the noise and look at the actual timeline, the story gets a lot stranger. Picture 2011. The Chinese EV market wasn't a titan, it was a joke. One of their biggest brands, BYD, had just launched a flagship hybrid and managed to sell a grand total of 11 cars internationally. 11. The government was throwing billions at the problem, but there were no charging stations, the batteries were subpar, and consumers weren't buying the hype. At that moment, the West wasn't worried, they were dismissive. Yet fast forward to today, and 60% of all EVs sold globally are Chinese. Tech giants like Xiaomi companies that usually make your smartphone are now building cars because the profits are too massive to ignore. It looks like an overnight miracle of state-run engineering. The common narrative is that China did this through sheer state power and aggressive isolationism. But there's a much more uncomfortable irony at the heart of this rise. While Western leaders today warn of an existential economic threat, the reality is that the foundation of China's EV dominance wasn't built in a vacuum. It was built with American blueprints, fueled by American investors, and accelerated by US companies that decided China was a better place to innovate than their own backyard. We are currently shouting at a house that we held by the bricks for. Okay, I have to pause right there because I'm still hung up on that number. 11 cars.
11.
We're talking about BYD here. Build your dreams. The company that is currently trading blows with Tesla for the title of largest EV manufacturer on Earth.
The very same one.
And you're telling me that in 2011, which feels like yesterday, they sold 11 cars outside of China? That can't be right. It feels like a typo in the data set.
It does feel like a typo, doesn't it? But I've double-checked the trade figures, and it is absolutely real. And honestly, it's probably the most important number we're going to discuss today.
So?
Because if you want to understand the sheer panic happening in Washington and Brussels and Detroit right now, you have to understand that 11, it just completely destroys the myth that this was some kind of smooth, predestined path to victory.
Right, because the common narrative we hear on the news is that China has this monolith, a 100-year master plan where everything just goes right step by step.
Exactly.
But selling 11 cars, that sounds like a disaster. It sounds like a product nobody wanted.
It was a disaster. The early cars were objectively bad. Really bad. They were clunky. The fit and finish were terrible. Imagine like 1990s budget plastics. And the range was just laughable compared to a regular gas car.
Right.
But that's why this story is so fascinating. We were looking at a phoenix rising from the ashes of a very expensive and, frankly, a very embarrassing public failure.
So the mission for this deep dive is to bridge that gap. How do you go from being the punchline of the automotive world, selling fewer cars globally than a local dealership sells in a weekend, to controlling 60% of the entire global market?
It was an incredible arc.
We have a massive stack of research here, policy documents from Beijing, supply chain breakdowns, and even investment reports from Wall Street.
And we're going to break this down into 3 specific pillars to make sense of it. First, we have to look at state capacity, and I don't just mean the government spent money, but how they spent it, especially when things are going wrong.
Okay, state capacity.
Second, we need to look at the hard world, the physical stuff, infrastructure, mining, manufacturing.
And the third one, which I think is going to ruffle some feathers, is the Western synergy. The idea that we, the West, actually helped build the beast we are now so afraid of.
That is the kicker. It's the uncomfortable truth that gets left out of the stump speeches and the angry headlines.
Yeah.
But before we get to the geopolitics, we have to go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
You have to strip away the 2026 context and look at what this actually felt like on the ground when it all started.
Let's do that. And I think we have a story here that sets the scene perfectly for that first pillar, for state capacity.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a mid-level researcher named Chen sitting in a dimly lit office in Beijing back in 2002. At that time, the streets were dominated by the roar of internal combustion engines and the dream of owning a Volkswagen Santana. I heard that when the government first announced an 800 million euro investment into electric vehicle R&D, Chen's colleagues laughed. They called it science fiction. While the rest of the world was doubling down on fracking and bigger SUVs, Chen was tasked with drafting the blueprints for a future that didn't yet have a single commercial charging pile. He spent his nights studying battery chemistries that most experts said would never move a 2-ton car. For Chen, the 5-year plan wasn't just a bureaucratic document, it was a shield that protected his impossible project from the short-term pressures of a market that wanted gasoline. As a tech analyst who follows these trends, I find Chen's story fascinating because it puts a human face on what we coldly call state capacity. It's easy to look back from 2026 and see a masterstroke of policy, but for the people on the ground in 2002, it was a test of pure, stubborn endurance. We often debate the merits of state intervention, but this level of multi-decade consistency is a rare phenomenon. It reminds us that global leadership isn't just won by innovation alone, but by the sheer political will to stay the course when everyone else thinks you're chasing a ghost. Science fiction. That phrase really contextualizes it for me. I think we forget what 2002 was like. Completely.
This was pre-iPhone. This was pre-social media as we know it. The biggest car news in America was probably the Hummer H2.
The H2, right, a monument to gasoline.
Exactly.
Right.
And here's this guy, Chen, being told to design a battery car in a country that was still largely riding bicycles or, aspiring to buy a knockoff VW. It's just a different universe.
And you have to remember, in 2002, China was the world's factory, but for low-value goods.
Right. Plastic toys, T-shirts.
Plastic toys, textiles, cheap electronics. The idea that China could compete in automotive engineering, which was really the crown jewel of manufacturing, was just ludicrous to the establishment.
Who were the kings then? Germany, Japan?
Germany, Japan, the US, they had a 100-year head start on the internal combustion engine, or ICE.
And those engines are incredibly complex. I mean, the metallurgy, the timing, the thousands of moving parts, it's as much an art as it is engineering.
A modern internal combustion engine is a masterpiece of mechanical precision. Trying to catch up to Mercedes-Benz or Toyota on their home turf, it would have been industrial suicide. So China realized this.
They realized that if they played the game by the existing rules, they would always be second-class citizens. They would be assembling German cars in China, not inventing their own. They'd be a customer, not a competitor.
So the 800 million yuan investment that Chen's story mentions, what was the actual logic there? Was it just throwing money at a wall and hoping something would stick?
No, it was highly strategic. That money kickstarted something called the 863 program. This was their high-tech national development initiative. And the logic was based on a concept called technological leapfrogging.
Leapfrogging. So like skipping the landline phase and going straight to cell phones. I've heard that analogy for developing nations.
That's exactly it. It's a classic development strategy. China looked at the auto industry and said, okay, we can't beat them on engines. We will never make a better V8 than BMW. It's just not going to happen.
Too much institutional knowledge, too many patents.
Decades of it. But, they said, what if engines aren't the future?
So if you can't win the race, you change the sport.
You invent a new sport where everyone is starting at zero. And in 2002, that's what EVs were. Nobody had a good electric vehicle. GM had famously killed the EV1 just a few years earlier.
Right.
Toyota was doing hybrids, but not full EVs. The field was wide open. The thinking was, if China started then, they would be on the same starting line as the US and Germany and Japan. No 100-year disadvantage.
But this wasn't just some vague idea floating around in a government ministry. There was a specific person behind this push. We need to talk about Wang Gang. The sources describe him as the father of the EV movement.
Wang Gang is an incredibly interesting character, and you're right, he's central to this whole story. Because he wasn't a career politician. He didn't come up through the party ranks in a rural province.
He was a tech guy.
He was an engineer. And not just any engineer. He spent a decade working for Audi in Germany.
Wow, so he was inside the beast. He was seeing the absolute best the West had to offer.
He was deep inside the Western automotive elite. He knew exactly how a state-of-the-art German engine was designed and built. And while he was there, he had two realizations.
Okay.
First, he saw that the internal combustion engine had basically reached a plateau. It was getting harder and harder to squeeze more efficiency out of it. You're fighting for 1 or 2% gains.
Diminishing returns.
Exactly. Second, he saw that China was literally choking on smog. The pollution in cities like Beijing was becoming a massive political crisis. It was a public health disaster.
Right. I remember the photos from the Beijing Olympics era around 2008. You couldn't see across the street.
You couldn't. It was that bad. So Wang Gang returns to China in 2000, and he submits this proposal to the State Council. It was called On the Development of Automotive New Clean Energy.
And what was the core of his pitch?
His pitch was brilliant because it wasn't just about the environment, though that was part of it. It was about industrial security. He argued that if China relied on gas cars, they would be dependent on foreign oil and foreign engine technology forever.
A double dependency.
A double dependency. So EVs were a way to break free from both at the same time. You could power them with electricity generated at home, and you could own the underlying technology.
And the government listened.
The state council bought it hook, line, and sinker. They made him the Minister of Science and Technology. And get this, he was the first non-party member to hold a cabinet post in decades.
That's a huge signal.
It's a massive signal. It showed they were serious. And he began writing this strategy directly into the 5-year plans.
Let's talk about this 5-year plans. Because in the West, we have this 4-year election cycle. A president comes in, sets a policy, and then the next person comes in and rips it all up.
Yeah.
Drill, baby, drill, turns into the Green New Deal, and then back again. How does the 5-year plan structure change that dynamic?
It creates certainty.
Yeah.
It creates long-term consistency. Once EV development was written into the 11th 5-year plan, that's 2006 to 2010, it became, for all intents and purposes, law.
It wasn't just a suggestion.
It meant that every level of government, from the central bank down to the local mayor, had to orient their resources toward this goal. And that's when the money really started flowing. They shifted from that initial 800 million yuan to 10 billion yuan.
Wow. That is a massive jump in cash.
That's an order of magnitude difference.
But here's the thing, and I want to play devil's advocate here. Money doesn't equal success. We've seen governments throw money at things all the time.
Of course.
The U.S. government gave $500 million to Solyndra for solar panels, and they went bankrupt in 2 years. Just because you have a plan with a capital P doesn't mean you actually have a product people want.
You are absolutely right. And this brings us right back to that Valley of Death period around 2011 and 2012.
The 11 cars.
The 11 cars. Despite all the planning, despite Wan Gang's vision, the market reality was just brutal. We have McKinsey data here that shows in the third quarter of 2011, there were only about 1,000 EVs registered in the entire country.
1,000 cars. In a country of 1.3 billion people, that is statistically zero.
It's a rounding error. It's nothing. And remember the BYD stat, 11 cars sold internationally. If this were a Western public company, the CEO would have been fired.
Oh, instantly.
The stock would have collapsed. The entire EV division would have been scrapped as a failure.
The market has spoken, right? That's what we would say. Consumers don't want these things, so we should move on.
But because of the state capacity model, they didn't move on. They didn't see it as a market signal to quit. They viewed it as a structural problem to be solved.
So they did a post-mortem.
They analyzed why it was failing. And they realized 2 fundamental things. One, the technology wasn't good enough yet. It was quantity over quality, a bunch of bad cars. And 2, even if you bought one, there was nowhere to charge the thing.
So instead of quitting, they doubled down.
They doubled down and they shifted strategy. They moved from just funding R&D in a lab to funding the entire ecosystem. And that resilience, that sheer political will to sustain a loss-making industry for 20 years is the defining difference.
Chen, our researcher from the story, kept his job.
Chen kept his job because the state decided to protect the project from the market until the project was strong enough to survive in the market.
It's almost like they were treating the entire industry like a startup that had an infinite runway of venture capital.
Technology.
Except the venture capitalist was the government, and they didn't care about quarterly returns. They cared about the 20-year return.
But even a startup with infinite money fails if it doesn't build something real. You can't just have policy papers and subsidies. You need concrete. You need steel. You need the physical world to cooperate.
Which brings us to the second pillar, the hard world. Because you can have the best battery in the world, but if you can't plug it in, it's just a very heavy, very expensive paperweight.
Exactly right.
I recently saw a series of old photos from a project manager named Lao Zhao, who worked on the outskirts of Shenzhen around 2012. While Silicon Valley was obsessed with social media apps, Zhao was knee-deep in mud, overseeing the installation of some of the country's first massive charging hubs. I read a post where he described the infrastructure fever of those years, the pressure to meet the 11th 5-year plan's targets. He wasn't just building chargers, he was part of a cultural shift that prioritized physical, hard industry over digital, soft goods. There were months when the chargers stood empty, mocked as monuments to nowhere, because the cars hadn't caught up to the technology yet. But Zhao kept building, driven by a national conviction that if you build the nervous system, the body will eventually follow. Looking at Zhao's experience, I'm struck by how much we underestimate the power of physical infrastructure. In the West, we often wait for the market to demand a service before we build it, but Zhao's story illustrates a different logic. The rapid scaling of the physical world is a precursor to economic transformation. It's a reminder that the EV revolution wasn't just about the cars themselves, but about the millions of tons of concrete and copper wire laid by people like Zhao, who transformed the landscape before the first customer even turned a key. monuments to nowhere. That is such a vivid image, just rows and rows of high-tech charging stalls standing in a muddy field with not a single car in sight. It sounds incredibly wasteful.
It looks like waste to a Western economist, right?
Yeah.
Because we operate on a model of market pull. In the U.S., a company like ChargePoint or Electrify America isn't going to build a big charging station in rural Montana unless they have data showing there are enough Teslas or Ford F-150 Lightnings nearby to actually pay for the electricity and turn a profit.
They wait for the demand.
They wait for the demand. And that creates the classic chicken-egg problem.
Right. I'm not going to buy an EV if I'm worried I can't charge it on a road trip, but nobody is going to build a charger for me if I don't buy the EV.
And the U.S. is still struggling with this today. We have broken chargers, different plug standards, huge gaps in coverage outside of, California and the Northeast.
It's a mess.
China solved the chicken and egg problem by just buying 10 million chickens and building 1,000 coops simultaneously. They used state push. They decided that what looks like waste in the short term was actually just investment in the long term.
So they poured the concrete first?
They poured the concrete first. The numbers in the notes are just staggering. They missed their initial targets. The sources say they wanted 400,000 charging piles by 2015, and they missed by a mile. They only had about 16,000 by 2011.
Another failure.
Another failure on paper, but they just kept going. What's the count today?
It's 1.8 million public charging points.
1.8 million. And to put that in perspective, that is roughly 14 times the number in the United States.
14 times for a country that's roughly the same physical size.
Yeah. And that completely changes the psychology of the consumer. We talk about range anxiety in the West. It's that constant nagging fear that you'll be stranded on the highway with a dead battery. In major Chinese cities and on their highway networks, that fear is evaporating. If you know there is a fast charger every 50 kilometers, buying an EV isn't a risk anymore. It's just a car.
I want to touch on that cultural point that Lao Zhao, the project manager, mentioned, the mud versus apps thing. While he was literally knee-deep in mud in 2012, what were we doing in the West? We were launching Instagram. We were getting excited about Snapchat. We were building the app economy.
We were financializing our economy and digitizing our social lives. We were focusing on soft tech. And look, there's a reason for that. Software margins are incredibly high, they scale instantly, and investors love them.
Right.
Pouring concrete is hard, it's low margin, it's dirty, it's capital intensive.
But you can't drive an app to work.
And China's big industrial plan, Made in China 2025, was a deliberate, strategic pivot to say, we will dominate the hard stuff. They specifically targeted 80% domestic market share for new energy vehicles.
So they were choosing to focus on atoms while we were focusing on bits.
They realized that the digital world ultimately runs on physical hardware. And if you control the hardware, you control the future.
And it's not just the chargers. It goes so much deeper than that. We need to talk about vertical integration because I think a lot of people hear that term and their eyes just glaze over.
Yeah, it sounds like business school jargon.
Oh, they own the supply chain. But what does that actually mean for the price of the car you can buy?
Okay, let's break it down. It's the difference between cooking a meal from scratch, using vegetables you grew in your own garden, versus ordering Uber Eats.
Okay, explain.
In the traditional Western auto model, let's say Ford creates a design for a new EV. Then they go to a supplier for the seats, a supplier for the chips, a supplier for the glass, and a supplier for the battery.
They assemble pieces made by hundreds of other companies.
Exactly. And let's just look at the battery. Ford buys it from, say, SK On or Panasonic. But Panasonic doesn't own the whole process. They buy the refined lithium from a chemical company. That chemical company buys the raw ore from a mine in Australia or Chile.
And every single one of those companies in that chain needs to make a profit.
The miner takes a 15% margin. The refiner takes a 15% margin. The battery cell maker takes a 15% margin. By the time Ford gets the finished battery, they are paying for 3 or 4 layers of profit on top of the actual cost of production.
It's stacked on top of each other.
It's a profit stack. Now look at BYD.
What do they do?
BYD is a closed loop. They own stakes in the lithium mines in Chile, Africa, and Brazil's Lithium Valley. They refine the chemical themselves. They make their own battery cells. They make their own semiconductors through BYD Semiconductor. They put it all in the car. They eliminate all those middlemen margins.
So they can sell a car for, say, $10,000 and still make a profit, while Ford would lose a ton of money selling the exact same car for $20,000.
That is the fundamental math. And it gets even crazier than that. They even built their own ships.
The BYD Explorer #1, I saw the picture. It looks like a floating city. It's enormous.
It's a roll-on, roll-off cargo carrier. During the post-pandemic supply chain crisis, shipping rates went through the roof. Car companies were fighting for space on boats, so BYD said, fine, we'll just build our own Navy.
That is next level.
They control the process from the dirt in the ground all the way to the delivery at the port in Rotterdam.
That is terrifyingly efficient.
But here is where we have to pivot. Because if you listen to what we've said so far, the determined state, the massive infrastructure, the vertical integration, you'd think China did this all in a bunker.
Right, that they locked the doors, built this perfect machine in isolation, and then unleashed it on an unsuspecting world.
But that's not the story at all. And this is the part of the deep dive that really surprised me, the uncomfortable irony. Because when you look at the actual history, the fingerprints of the West are all over this so-called closed loop.
This is the part that gets forgotten in the current geopolitical tension, isn't it? We act like this was some kind of hostile takeover from day one.
We do. But the reality is, the foundation of this entire industry was kickstarted by Western cooperation.
I was digging into those 2002 policy documents, the ones Wang Gang was involved in. His original plan explicitly stated the goal was to engage in technological exchanges with the United States, Germany, Japan.
They weren't hiding it.
No, they were sending out formal invitations. Please come help us.
And Western companies accepted those invitations with open arms. You have to remember the mindset of the 2000s. Globalization was the religion. China was seen as the ultimate growth market. It was the next big thing. Every CEO had to have a China strategy.
I found a quote from a General Motors executive back in 2010. He said, and I'm quoting here, "We'd love to produce all our electric vehicles here," talking about China.
Wow, and that sums it up perfectly. Western companies view China as two things: a source of cheap factory labor and a massive customer base.
1 billion potential car buyers.
Exactly. So they were happy to transfer knowledge. They set up these things called joint ventures, which were partnerships where they were legally required to share technology and designs with a Chinese partner company.
So it was the price of admission. You want to sell your Buicks in Shanghai, you have to teach your Chinese partner how to build a Buick.
That was the deal. And they thought they were just trading their factory workers. They thought they were getting the better end of the bargain, but they were actually trading their future competitors.
They didn't realize that the student was taking very careful notes with the intention of eventually taking over the whole school.
They didn't see it coming.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here again. You can't really blame American companies for investing where the growth is, can you? That's their fiduciary duty to their shareholders.
That's a fair pushback.
Are we saying a CEO in 2005 should have predicted a geopolitical rivalry 15 years in the future? That seems like a high bar.
It is a high bar. And in a vacuum, you're right. A CEO's job is to make money for shareholders now, not in 2025. Yeah. But the critique from the sources we're looking at is that they were incredibly naive about the technology transfer.
Yeah.
They handed over intellectual property that took decades and billions of dollars to develop, all for short-term market access.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just knowledge that flowed east, it was hard cash.
The Warren Buffett effect.
Yes. This is a pivotal moment in the story. It's 2008. The global financial crisis is raging. And Berkshire Hathaway drops $232 million for a 10% stake in BYD.
And we have to contextualize BYD in 2008. They were not a cool tech company. They were a battery company that made like knockoff Toyota Corollas.
They were known for inconsistent quality. Their car business was shaky at best. And then the Oracle of Omaha, the most conservative, respected, value-driven investor in America, says, I believe in this company.
It's a massive halo effect. It's a stamp of approval. It tells the entire global market, this is legitimate. This is a safe bet.
It opened the floodgates. That $232 million stake ballooned into billions in value, which gave BYD a massive war chest to fund R&D. But more importantly, it signaled to every other VC-funded investment bank that Chinese EVs were a smart bet. American capital fueled the very companies that are now terrifying American politicians.
And then there's the biggest catalyst of all. The one that involves Elon Musk.
Ah, the Tesla catfish effect.
I love this term. You have to explain the biology here for me.
So there's a story, it might be apocryphal, but it's illustrative, that if you transport live sardines in a big tank, they get lethargic and a lot of them die. But if you throw a single predatory catfish into the tank with them, the sardines have to keep swimming, keep moving to survive. They stay active and arrive at the market much healthier.
And in this metaphor, the early Chinese EV startups, companies like NIO, XPeng, Li Auto, they were the lazy sardines.
By around 2018, the Chinese one was flooded with hundreds of EV startups. But many of them were just existing to collect government subsidies. They were making bad cars and just living off government handouts.
So the state's plan was backfiring a little. It was creating zombies, not champions.
Exactly. The government realized this was a dead end. They needed to force them to actually compete on quality and price. They needed a predator.
So they let the shark in, or I guess the catfish.
They allowed Tesla to build the Shanghai Gigafactory. And crucially, this is the key part, they allowed Tesla to own it 100%, no joint venture, no mandatory local partner. This was unprecedented.
They broke their own rules.
They broke their own long-standing rules specifically to get Elon Musk to build his factory in Shanghai.
And the message to the domestic companies was, sink or swim. If you can't build a car that's better or cheaper than a Model 3, you don't deserve to exist.
And it worked. It wiped out dozens of the weak players.
Yeah.
But here is the beautiful irony of the story.
Yeah.
Tesla needed a local supply chain.
Right.
Tesla needed seats, glass, dashboards, batteries, and sensors delivered to the Shanghai factory every single day. So they went out and helped build up a whole network of local Chinese suppliers, training them to meet Tesla's very high standards for quality and efficiency.
And once those suppliers learned how to build high-quality parts for Tesla,
They could turn around and sell those same high-quality parts to BYD and NIO and XPeng, often for a lower price. Tesla effectively trained the entire ecosystem that its competitors now use to beat it.
the catfish made the whole pond stronger.
Much stronger.
That is wild. So let's recap this section. We funded the companies via Wall Street, we validated them to the world via Warren Buffett, and then we literally built their high-quality supply chains for them via Tesla.
And now, as we read in the intro, we are shouting at the house we helped build. The U.S. financial system, which is designed to prioritize open markets and find the most efficient producer, worked exactly as designed.
Right.
It found the most efficient place to invest capital. It just so happened that the most efficient place was the one building its own competition.
This leads us perfectly into how these companies actually operate on the ground now that they're established. We've talked about the state and we've talked about the West. But what about the interplay between them? We often think of it as state versus private, like the government just tells the company what to do. But it seems a lot more complicated than that.
It's much more of a partnership.
I saw an interview with an early engineer at BYD, let's call him Sun, who joined the company when they were still primarily making batteries for mobile phones. He recalled the moment the leadership pivoted toward the impossible goal of car manufacturing. It wasn't just a corporate decision, it was a response to a clear signal from the state that the future was electric. I heard that in those early days, the quality was shaky and the critics were brutal. However, because of the synergy between private ambition and state-led initiatives, Sun's team didn't have to worry about a bad quarter wiping them out. They were part of a collective industrial resilience model. When the domestic market was slow, the government's push for electric buses provided the lifeline they needed to refine their tech. From my perspective as a creator, Sun's story is a perfect example of why the state versus private dichotomy is often a false one in this context. What we see here is a results-oriented partnership. While some might view this through a skeptical lens of subsidies, I see a strategic alignment that allowed a private company to survive the valley of death that kills so many startups elsewhere. It's a narrative of technological sovereignty, the idea that a nation's industry should be robust enough to withstand global market fluctuations by rooting itself in a shared long-term vision, collective industrial resilience. That phrase really stands out. It sounds very different from the cutthroat Silicon Valley, fail fast, fail often mentality.
It's the polar opposite.
In the Valley, if you run out of VC money, you die. That's just Darwinism. Your employees go to the next startup.
It is different. In the U.S., we believe in creative destruction. If a startup fails, the talent and capital are freed up for the next one. In China, specifically in these strategic industries, they believe in guided survival. Look at the electric buses mentioned in Sun's story.
The Shenzhen bus fleet. I remember reading about this. The entire city of Shenzhen electrified its public bus fleet. Thousands and thousands of buses, basically overnight.
It was about 16,000 buses in total, and they bought them almost exclusively from one company, BYD.
And think about the timing here.
Right. This was when the consumer market for BYD's cars was still really weak. Nobody wanted a shaky electric sedan. But the city government of Shenzhen stepped in and said, we need 16,000 buses and we need them now.
That's a massive guaranteed injection of cash.
It's guaranteed revenue. It's a lifeline. It gave Sun's engineering team the runway to iterate and improve their technology. They could test their batteries on buses, which run all day, start and stop constantly, a brutal duty cycle, and gather incredible amounts of real-world data.
So the government acted as the customer of first resort.
That's the term for it. When the private market isn't ready for your product, the state steps in and buys it to keep the factory running and the R&D funded.
And this allowed BYD to pull off one of the craziest pivots in modern business history. Remember, they started making batteries for Motorola and Nokia phones in 1995. Then they pivoted to cars in 2002 by buying a failing state-owned car manufacturer. It's like if the company that makes your laptop battery today decided to buy Chrysler tomorrow.
It sounds absurd when you put it like that.
Yes, but they had a secret weapon, didn't they? They weren't car guys trying to learn batteries. They were battery guys who learned how to build a car around the battery.
That's the crucial distinction.
I want to circle back to the tech here, because there's a piece I still don't quite get. If the West had a 100-year head start on engines, surely our battery tech was better too. Why didn't Tesla just crush BYD on range and performance immediately?
Because the West, for a long time, was obsessed with the wrong metric. We were chasing performance at all costs. We focused on a battery chemistry called NMC.
Stop there. What is NMC?
Nickel, manganese, cobalt. Think of an NMC battery like a high-performance sports car engine. It packs a huge amount of energy into a small, lightweight space. It gives you incredible range and acceleration.
The stuff that lets a Tesla do 0 to 60 in 2 seconds?
Exactly. But it has two major downsides. It uses cobalt, which is very expensive and ethically problematic to mine, often using child labor, and it's chemically volatile. If you puncture it, it can burn very, very hot.
Right, the thermal runaway videos you see online, it's scary stuff.
As BYD looked at the periodic table and went a completely different direction, they went back to an older, less fashionable chemistry, LFP.
LFP.
Lithium iron phosphate.
And what's the analogy for LFP if NMC is a sports car?
Think of LFP like a big, reliable diesel generator. It's heavier, it doesn't have the same zip or energy density, but it is incredibly stable and safe. You can puncture it, you can crush it, and it generally won't catch fire. And crucially, it uses iron, which is cheap and one of the most abundant elements on Earth.
Okay, but if it's heavy and low energy, how do you make a good car out of it? That sounds like a step backwards.
And that was the engineering breakthrough. They called it the blade battery. Before this, battery makers had to put their individual cells into protective modules and then put those modules into a big battery pack. It was like putting eggs in a carton and then putting the cartons in a big box. Lots of wasted space.
Right, lots of plastic and structural material, not enough actual battery.
Exactly. BYD's engineers redesigned the cell itself to look like a long, thin blade, and they made the blade strong enough to be a structural part of the car's frame. They just stacked them together like a deck of cards.
So they eliminated the modules.
They eliminated the modules, which saved so much space and weight that they could pack enough of this weaker LFP chemistry into the car to get the same or even better range as the more expensive NMC batteries.
So they took a cheaper, safer, worse chemistry and engineered their way around its flaws to beat the expensive Western batteries on price.
Correct. And now, guess what chemistry Tesla is using in its standard range cars?
LFP.
And Ford is scrambling to license LFP technology, as one of the sources put it perfectly. By making it cheaper, China wins.
I want to touch on one last piece of the state capacity puzzle before we look at the future, the whitelist. This was mentioned in the sources as a kind of VIP club for battery makers.
This is the sharp protectionist edge of the strategy. We talked about subsidies, the government giving you a tax break to buy an EV. But in 2015, they introduced a new rule. You only got the subsidy if your car's battery came from a supplier on the official whitelist.
And let me guess who was on the list.
Only Chinese companies, primarily CATL and BYD. The global giants LG from Korea, Panasonic from Japan were explicitly excluded.
That is brutal. So if GM wanted to sell a car in China and have it be eligible for the subsidy, they had to dump their Korean supplier and buy their batteries from a Chinese one.
That's exactly what it meant. It effectively locked foreign battery makers out of the biggest and fastest growing market in the world during the most critical years of scaling. It guaranteed that CATL and BYD would get all the volume.
And in manufacturing, volume is everything.
Volume drives costs down. It's the whole game.
So they walled off the garden until their own flowers were big and strong enough to survive in the wild, and then they opened the gates again.
And by the time they opened the gates a few years later, CATL and BYD weren't just Chinese champions. They were global titans.
So let's fast forward and look at the scoreboard today. We've got the tech, the infrastructure, the vertically integrated supply chain. China now controls 60% of global EV sales. BYD sells more new energy vehicles than Tesla. And now the tech giants are jumping into the ring.
Right.
Xiaomi, the phone company's making cars. Huawei is making the smart driving systems for them.
The entry of the tech giants is the next phase, and it's a huge deal. Companies like Xiaomi are used to the brutal pace of the smartphone world. They launch a new flagship phone every 12 months.
Well, traditional car companies usually take 4 or 5 years to launch a new model.
It's a massive clash of cultures. And the Chinese market right now is described in all the sources as a bloodbath. I wonder what Chen, that researcher from 2002, thinks about all this now.
Yeah. He went from being laughed at for his science fiction project to designing the engine of a global trade war where prices are dropping every single week.
He probably sees it as a victory, but a very painful one. The competition in China is so fierce that profit margins are razor thin. It is hyper-competitive. And that domestic bloodbath is exactly what is pushing this massive export wave.
If you can't make enough money selling your car in Shanghai because of the price war, you put it on one of your BYD-owned ships and send it to Europe.
Exactly. We hear Western politicians talk about overcapacity. They say China is producing too many cars, dumping them on the world market. But many of the Chinese sources argue it's not overcapacity in the classic sense of unwanted cars sitting in lots. It's just fierce efficiency, seeking new markets.
And higher margins.
And much higher margins.
Yeah.
A BYD car might sell for double the price in Germany that it sells for in China.
So Europe is the profit center. The domestic market is for achieving scale. The export market is for achieving profit.
Europe, Southeast Asia, South America, they're targeting places like Thailand and Brazil very aggressively.
And the West is finally reacting. We've got tariffs. The U.S. put a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. The EU is launching investigations. And suddenly we are hearing a lot about security threats.
And notice the timing on that. It's interesting, isn't it? We didn't hear a lot about data privacy threats when China was selling us cheap toasters or assembling our iPhones.
Right.
We hear about it now that they are beating Western companies in high-tech, high-value auto manufacturing.
To be fair, though, a modern car is basically a robot with cameras and sensors on wheels. It maps the streets you drive on. I can see why a government would be genuinely worried about where all that data goes.
Oh, the security concerns are absolutely valid. A car is a sophisticated surveillance device, but there are also very convenient tools for protectionism. It's much easier for a politician to ban a competitor for national security than to admit we just can't compete on price and features.
It seems like the tables have turned so completely. I read that Volkswagen, the company whose Santana was the dream car in China in 2002, the company Wang Gang looked up to, is now buying a stake in the Chinese startup XPeng to get their technology.
That right there is the ultimate symbol of this whole reversal. In 2002, China invited Volkswagen in to learn how to make cars. In 2024, Volkswagen is buying into a Chinese startup to learn how to make smart cars.
Because they need the software.
They need the software, the connectivity, the voice control that works perfectly. Because the battleground has shifted again. It's not about the engine anymore. It's about the computer that runs the car.
And that is where companies like Xiaomi and Huawei have a massive native advantage.
A huge advantage. Western car makers are metal benders, trying to learn how to write code. Chinese car makers are increasingly coders who have learned how to bend metal.
That is a profound difference. So where does this leave us? I mean, can the West catch up? Or is the game over for the legacy automakers?
It's not over, but the hill they have to climb is incredibly steep. When you have lost the entire supply chain, when the mine, the refiner, the battery maker, and the chip maker are all predominantly in China, you can't just flip a switch and bring it all back home.
It's not a one-year project.
You have to rebuild the entire industrial base. That takes a generation. It takes its own kind of 5-year plan.
It feels like we are at a truly pivotal moment in industrial history.
We absolutely are. We witnessed the shift from the horse to the car a century ago. Now we are witnessing the shift from gas to electric, and the entire center of gravity for the auto world has shifted east.
So, to wrap this all up, let's just look back at the journey we've traced. We started with our researcher Chen in 2002, being laughed at for his science fiction project. We saw Lao Zhao in the mud in 2012, building chargers for cars that didn't even exist yet. We saw the Valley of Death in 2011 with just 11 cars sold, and the Western investors who, ironically, helped bridge that valley. And now we see a global titan.
It's a story of patience, policy, and a lot of unintended consequences. China was willing to play a very, very long game, a game measured in decades, not in quarterly earnings reports.
So we end on this thought. We often talk about innovation as a spark, you know, a guy in a garage with a brilliant idea. But the story of the Chinese EV is a reminder that a true industrial revolution isn't just a spark. It's a slow burning fire fueled by decades of policy, concrete, and capital. The West provided the capital and some of the initial spark, but China built the fireplace. Now that the fire is roaring, the rest of the world has to decide. Do we try to stamp it out with tariffs, or do we finally start building a fireplace of our own?